It's finally here. After 120 levels, 2 whole separate continents, and even a bug where almost every NPC and mob disappeared, it's time to talk about why you should use Cataclysm to level your character in World of Warcraft. Kind of. I'm just gonna cut straight to it because we have a lot to talk about. This video is part of a series where I go through each expansion and find out the good and the bad when it comes to leveling. This time, since Cataclysm is joined with Classic, I have leveled 2 whole characters, one on the Horde, doing primarily Cataclysm zones, and the other on the Alliance, where I only use the revamped Classic zones. I was expecting to have a back and forth of pros and cons to each, trying to decide which of the 2 paths, Cataclysm or Classic, were better, but after doing both, the winner is pretty clear. Okay, when talking about the questing, clear is a bit of an exaggeration, but by golly if I won't enjoy talking about my distaste for the Cataclysm dungeons. That's getting a bit ahead of myself though. The real meat of this video is all about the questing, so let's look at the numbers. In all honesty, Cataclysm questing is pretty adequate, but it's also a whole hour slower than just using the revamped zones. In terms of questing quality, I would rate them the same. The only difference is the new zones obviously have more room for creativity, as the revamps had to follow a certain structure that was already laid out for them, but that didn't always lead to something good. Anyone that has done Mount Hyjal questing will know that some quests, like the aerial jousting, are cool on paper, but WoW just didn't have the tools to make it right back then. Side note, dynamic flight makes it work, but you can't use that when you're doing these quests. It totals out to being an even playing field in terms of quest quality. But simplicity is a big win in Classic's favor. To fully unlock the quests in Catazones, you have to jump through some hoops. That mostly means hoping it shows up on the bounty board that people rarely use. For Classic zones, you just have to fly there, and given that a lot of them are designed to chain into each other, it makes it even easier. The gearing between the two is in the favor of Classic again, but with an asterisk this time, though the reason for that is an easy fix. The Catazones are endgame zones, so their fielding of loot is widespread. You'll get plenty of helmets, necklaces, and trinkets from doing them. For Classic, if you want even a glimpse of a trinket, you'll need to plan a bit. I'll talk more about that in the gearing section, but a sneak peek is that even without getting 2 trinkets, my item level at the end of the Classic zones was one of the best this series has ever seen. I think you get the point by now. The revamped Classic zones are either equal to or better than their Cataclysm counterparts. I will say that Cataclysm has quest abundance locked down, but even that has its drawbacks as variety suffers. A change of scenery sometimes is always nice to keep the engine running, so my choice for this episode are the revamped Classic zones. But how do they compare to other expansions? Pretty heckin' well. Time-wise, it's towards the front of the pack. Not the fastest, but less than an hour off the fastest so far. The biggest difference is going to be the amount of zones used to complete their questing. Throughout my journey, I used most of 7 zones. If you're a fan of variety, this is the leveling expansion for you. Some expansions can feel too fast with their leveling. You get through them in 3 or 4 zones. But as I'm writing this, I'm realizing there's around 50 zones to choose from when leveling in Cataclysm. While I recommended sticking to the revamped Classic ones, that doesn't mean you can't throw in Mount Hyjal onto your route. 50 zones is both a boon and a curse. Your choices are as flexible as they will ever be. Want a forest? We got those. Want a swamp? Kinda weird, but here you go. Want a desolated firescape that also has a giant hole in the middle filled with metallic dwarves? You know, we have that. It's like the Ben and Jerry's of leveling. You're gonna find a flavor you like simply because there's so dang many of them. It also means that you will only experience like 17% of them on a single visit, but that just means that your next time through can be completely and utterly different. I didn't even realize the potential until just now. We've already established that I'm no math genius in the past, but if it takes 7 zones to get from level 10 to level 70, and there are 50 or so zones to choose from, that means there's 99.8 million ways to level a character through Cataclysm questing. In reality, it's much less because some zones can't be done at level 10, but like every mainstream news outlet, I'm going to use the biggest number without factoring in things like restrictions. The downside is, if you're looking for a full experience of Cataclysm zones, both new and revamped, good luck. But again, you can do it multiple times in new ways, so it's a trade-off. Now, I do have an extra caveat to throw in there. If you're looking to get a good spread of gear while questing, you're gonna have to do this one easy trick. Make sure that you put the traditionally higher level zones at the end of your questing. For me, I started with Elwynn Forest and its surrounding zones like Westfall and Duskwood. Then I took a flight all the way to the Plague Lands to make sure I got some specific loot slots. You have to remember that Cataclysm was only the third expansion in World of Warcraft. It still had the classic philosophy when it came to questing rewards. You didn't get things like helmets, necklaces, or trinkets until higher level zones, so don't expect to find those in a place like Red Ridge. It's much less a problem if you use heirlooms, but like the rest of this series, I didn't use them. Overall, I would give the questing experience a solid 8 out of 10. My appreciation of these zones have only gone up since Classic was released in 2019. I enjoy going back and seeing how they changed, but even without that lens, these zones are simply fun. Fun and simple. This rating is specifically for revamped Classic zones, but Cata zones would get a 7 out of 10 still. I'm just not going to count it in the final end-all be-all video. I'm taking the best to the finals. This is where Classic is just flat out a step above Cataclysm. I wish they would separate Cataclysm Chromie Time from Classic, but I see why they don't. Because once you reach a certain level, the game automatically switches your dungeon queue to Cata dungeons. Some people don't even know that you can just switch it right back, which is exactly what you should do. I don't know what I would rather do, level only using Cataclysm dungeons or complement Shadowlands. I was shocked when they started using some of these for Mythic Plus dungeons. At that point, they should just revamp some Wrath and BC dungeons as well. In terms of the leveling dungeons, there are very few of them, and each one has something that is experimental in a bad way, whether it be a boss or the actual layout itself. Let's take Throne of the Tides for example. It's just... okay, let's not use this part of it. Alright, really? Are you kidding me? Look. That dungeon has more backtracking than an insurance company's promises. I see the classic dungeons as far superior to what Cataclysm has to offer, especially since the longer ones have been broken down into bite-sized pieces. So it's just like the quests, we're going to use those for our rating, starting with the pros of the dungeons. There are so many on the list that you are bound to have the advantages of variety. I know they only unlock in tiers, but you have a good amount of them by level 30, and the ones you get access to only get better. It also ensures that you won't really run out of dungeon quests to do. Little boosts in XP like that only accelerates your journey through them. If you told me I could only choose one expansion's dungeons to level my characters through for the rest of time, I would choose these ones. I would choose all of Classic as the only leveling expansion. I already splurged about the insane amount of zones to experience. It's also the dungeon set I would most recommend to someone just getting into the game. They are simple, they have good length, and they contain just enough spice to introduce you to more modern mechanics. It's the perfect environment to learn the game and your class in. Not to mention, I find these dungeons the most relaxing to do in the entire game. Some other leveling expansions have some jank in their dungeons, especially TBC and Wrath. Classic dungeons do to an extent. I'm not saying they're the best ever designed. Some of them also suffer from backtracking and confusing pathing. I'm looking at you, Dire Maul West and East, but the majority of them don't suffer from that problem. And considering the majority is a lot of dungeons, I give a pass to the few stinkers. These dungeons are getting a whopping 9 out of 10. The stinkers do keep it from a perfect score, but dang if any expansion could get one, it's Classic dungeons. They are a perfect mix of variety, simplicity, and fun. I really wish they weren't shadowed by Cata dungeons, but I am glad that they have been added to the time walking rotation. Cata dungeons get a I don't know, I'll say like a 4. Maybe that's not fair, but they aren't being considered for the overall rating, so it's fine. But before the overall rating, we have to talk about... I am pleasantly surprised and confused at the same time. In the questing section, I mentioned that the gearing ended up pretty good. Let me tell you, it wasn't looking that way for the majority of my journey, on the classic side at least. The Cata zones do have a wider array of quest rewards, however what both of them do have is bags. I've done enough of the starter zones to realize that they are designed to give you a full set of bags all in one zone. These won't have a great amount of slots, but it will be around 24 to 30 in total. It makes questing so much smoother. But speaking of slots, I have no idea how the classic zones managed to give me such a high item level. I got to item level 326 despite missing an entire gear slot. I only got a single trinket, and that was even a world drop, it wasn't a quest reward. Just to see what it could have been, I put on a second trinket using heirlooms and my item level rocketed to 347. For reference, the target goal is item level 350. That is when you can queue for War Within Dungeons. I have 0 pieces of gear that are under item level 300. That is a first ever for this series. My lowest was a 304 cloak, which if I replace with an heirloom cloak, it gets me to item level 349. Absolutely insane. As I said before, I would recommend doing high level zones later in your journey if you are using classic zones and don't have any heirlooms. The frequency of getting gear is pretty good. The problem is it tends to be the same slot. If you are unsure what qualifies as a high level zone, don't worry. Here's a list of the Eastern Kingdom zones that are good for the later half of your journey. I'll put up a list for Kalimdor in a moment. And here are the Kalimdor zones that are traditionally the endgame ones. Speaking of Kalimdor, my Kata character ended up with an item level of 301. Pretty poor showing in that regard, especially compared to what you get from the revamped zones. However, they both give a respectable amount of gold, 5,300. It's nothing crazy, but it is a good start. Once again, I'm taking Classics gearing into the rating. This is another solid score at an 8 out of 10. It did pretty well despite missing a whole trinket slot. I would give it a higher score, but it's not reliable enough for a 9. In fact, it would have been a 7 if you didn't get all the bags. Just make sure to include a race's starting zone in your pathing. Here are the Alliance starter zones. I would recommend Elwynn Forest or Dunmoreau. And here are the Horde starting zones. You can't really go wrong with Durotar. And it seems you can't really go wrong with Revamped Classic for your leveling. Let's see the overall rating. I don't think it's any secret that I view this as one of the best options for leveling a character in World of Warcraft. As stated before, this would be my preferred choice if I could only pick one forever, but I don't have to pick one forever, so it still needs a rating. Both the Horde and the Alliance sides are amazing. This was a postponed video idea, but at one point I started going through each starter zone and ranking them. It will likely be something I do in the future, but it gave me a taste for the potential on all sides. With Kata Dungeons out of the picture, I'm giving the overall rating a 9 out of 10. The zones have charm, the dungeons are great, and I went 120 levels without rethinking my choices to do so. I even had a bug that deleted every NPC and enemy on the Eastern Kingdoms. I recorded it and may make a video out of it in the future. If I was doing half points, I probably would have given Catachrome Time an 8.5, but I'm rounding up because I can and it feels right. The worst it got as a score is 8 in the gearing, and the only issue is if you don't have heirlooms you're gonna have to pre-plan a bit, but that can also be solved by dungeons, both are easy fixes. Now that I've finally gone back to do Kata, the next expansions are going to be in order of their release, starting with good old Legion, which isn't going to have an issue that I thought it did. I was mistaken in my perception, and I'll talk about that more in the next video. This is the halfway mark. Eventually, at the end of all of this, I'm going to do a big old video reviewing my ranks and putting them from worst to best. So if you want to be there for that, make sure to subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. My name has been Kale. Have a very good journey.